Some gold carries a weight that iron cannot measure.
When 101 Norsemen landed on an unknown, impossibly green shore, they expected a wilderness to conquer. They expected an enemy they could bleed. Instead, they stepped directly into the jaws of an ancient appetite older than the stars. Welcome to GDHorror. This is part 2 of 2 for Feathered Dark by Xasm. Dim the lights and let's find out where the wolves of the north sit on the cosmic food chain. Chapter 8. The God Notices. The fight on the apex platform was not a fight in the sense that Ulfric's men were accustomed to the term. His men were accustomed to opponents who wanted to survive the fight. The pyramid's inner guard, 12 men in the feather and obsidian armor that was the temple's warrior caste's equipment, wanted something different. Not death exactly, not indifference to death. Something that had passed through the territory of indifference and come out the other side into a state for which Ulfric did not have a word, and which he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe in the mead halls of the north with the vocabulary available to him, which was never sufficient. The obsidian-edged weapons opened wounds that iron did not open, wider at entry, the fractured edge leaving its geometry in the flesh, wounds that bled with a persistence that standard combat wounds did not. Bjarke, who was not primarily a fighter, received one such wound across the left side and fought with the specific angry focus of a man who has been educated abruptly about a subject he had previously only studied. Eric the Red-Handed, not the famous one, a different Eric called that for a birthmark rather than a history, received an obsidian-edged spear through the shoulder that he removed himself, screaming, and continued fighting with the arm partially functional, which was sufficient and which he later described as the most painful, useful thing he had ever done. The inner guard was formidable and disciplined, and had the advantage of terrain familiarity and the specific psychological fortification of men who did not believe that anything on the platform could kill them in any way that ultimately mattered. They were incorrect about this, as the final count established. But they were correct enough about it to make the correction expensive. Ulfric lost 11 men on the platform. The inner guard lost all 12 of theirs, and Quetzalcoatl lost 3 fingers from his right hand to Bjorn's seax before Bjorn's seax found a more conclusive argument. In the fighting's last moments, when the platform held only Norsemen, and the specific silence that follows completed violence, Ulfric became aware of a change in the air. Not the blood smell, which was considerable, not the torch smoke. A change beneath those things, a pressure, a density, the quality of attention that he had noted in old places and had always associated with the accumulated weight of what those places had witnessed. This was not that. This was active. This was the pressure of something that was present rather than impressed into the stone. Something that had received its accounting and had turned with the complete orientation of a very large appetite toward the source of the disruption. Thorvald, who was the youngest and whose sensitivities had not yet been organized into the professional configurations that experience would eventually produce, said,
"Something is looking at us."
Yes,
said Ulfric.
"From where?"
Ulfric looked at the sky. The sky above the pyramid's apex was clear. No cloud, the stars beginning to populate the dark in the particular density of a sky without competing light sources. The stars of a world that did not yet have cities bright enough to dim them. And in the stars, something that was not a star and was not the sky, and was not anything that the Norsemen's considerable collective experience of the world had previously produced as a category. It was large. The largeness was the first quality to register, before shape, before detail, simply the fact of a largeness that the eye kept trying to resolve into something proportionally coherent and kept failing. It was in the sky, and it was moving in the sky, but it was not moving in the way that things moved through the sky, not flying, not falling, but occupying the sky the way a thought occupies the mind, without the requirement of transit from one position to another. It had feathers. This was the detail that registered second, the specific quality of the surface in the starlight, a texture that was simultaneously scales and feathers, that shifted between the two depending on which part of the visible shape the eye attempted to focus on, as though the question of what it was one the thing had decided not to definitively answer, and it was looking at them. Not at the city, not at the pyramid, at the specific group of blood-covered Norsemen on the apex platform, with the complete undivided attention of something that had been interrupted in the middle of a familiar process by something entirely outside its experience. The feathered serpent god of the city of jade and blood and gold had not encountered Norsemen before. The Norsemen, to their credit, had not encountered the feathered serpent god before either. The difference was that the god was the size of a thought and moved like weather, and had been receiving its accounting for longer than the Norsemen's ancestors had been building ships.
Shields,
said Ulfric. The word came from the same place all his best tactical decisions came from. Not thought, not instinct, the third thing.
form on me. Move to the passage.
Chapter 9. The Descent. What came down from the sky came slowly, which was worse than quickly. Quick things could be outrun or fought, or at minimum the fighting of them had a grammar that combat experience provided entry to. What descended from the sky toward the apex platform moved in the manner of something that did not experience urgency, because urgency implied the possibility of not reaching the destination, and that possibility did not appear to be in the thing's operational vocabulary. It touched the altar first. The altar's stone surface, dark brown, the accumulated record of the accounting across generations, responded to the touch the way iron responds to a lodestone, a sudden orientation. The stone surface briefly illuminated from within by a light that was not fire and was not bioluminescence and was not any light that the Norsemen had a reference for. The light was the color of old jade. It ran along the carved channels in the altar's surface, channels that Ulfric had looked at earlier and identified as drainage, and through those channels into the pyramid stone, down through the tiers, the jade light finding the carved lines in every surface and illuminating them from within, the entire pyramid briefly becoming a structure of light rather than stone, the serpent feather carvings on every surface alive simultaneously in a way that made the pyramid scale suddenly comprehensible as a single unified object rather than an accumulation of carved details. The Norsemen on the platform saw this from the passage entrance, moving, and the ones who looked back saw it, and the ones who did not look back felt it in the stone beneath their feet. A vibration, low and total, the frequency of something very large, doing something very deliberate. Ragnar Tuax looked back. Ragnar had looked at many things in his 41 years. He had the face of a man who had decided, early in his relationship with the world, that the world could produce nothing that he would allow to determine his expression. He looked at what was on the altar and at what was in the sky above the altar, and at the light running through the pyramid's carved veins, and his face determined itself without his consultation. He turned back to the passage and he ran, and this was the correct decision, and he made it without discussion. Chapter 10. Berserker. The passage descent took 11 minutes. Ulfric knew this because Björn counted. Björn always counted. It was one of his methods, the imposition of number on chaos as a resistance technique, and reported the count afterward, and 11 minutes was the time it took 31 men to descend the passage that they had ascended in 7 minutes, because ascent had been deliberate and descent was not. The thing followed. Not immediately. It had its altar and its apex and its interrupted accounting to attend to. And it attended to these things with the specific thoroughness of a god for whom interruption was a new experience and completion was a very old one. But it followed. The passage's carved walls illuminated as it moved, the jade light running ahead of it through the carved channels, announcing its position the way a lamp carried through a dark hall announces the lamp bearer's position, except that the lamp was the size of the hall, and the hall was the size of the pyramid, and the pyramid was the size of a declaration. The men in the passage knew it was following, because the walls were lit from within, and because the stone was vibrating, and because there was a smell. Not blood, not torch smoke, but something that no one would afterward be able to describe, except by reference to what it reminded them of, which for Ulfric was the smell of the sea before a storm, and for Björn was the smell of a forge at maximum temperature, and for Thorvald, who was young and whose reference vocabulary was still developing, was the smell of something that had no name, and that he would subsequently spend years looking for a name for and never find one. They reached the lower chambers. The 6 in their alcoves were still there. 3 of them, in the time since the Norsemen had passed through, had undergone a change. The preparation compound's effect, or something else's effect. Something that the jade light running through the passage walls had contributed to. And the change had moved them from the between state that Bjarke had described into something further along the same continuum. They were not deceased. They were something that the word deceased did not fully address. Their eyes, which had been open and vacant in the compound's effect, were now open and occupied. Occupied by something that used their eyes as windows rather than as features. Knut the Quiet, who had maintained his composure through the entire descent, looked at the 6 alcoves and made a decision about them that his face announced before his body implemented it.
Leave them.
Ulfric said.
They're not...
I know what they are.
Ulfric said.
Leave them.
They left them. The 6 in the alcoves turned their occupied eyes to follow the Norsemen's movement through the passage, with the patient attention of things that were not going anywhere and knew it. The jade light reached the lower chambers as the last man exited to the approach road. Chapter 11. Hakon goes mad and becomes useful. The courtyard between the pyramid's base and the outer wall was where the organized retreat became something else. The outer guard had been reinforced. Quetzalcoatl's doubled watch now tripled in response to the sounds from the interior, forming a line across the approach road's courtyard intersection. in numbers that Ulfric assessed at 60 and revised upward as more emerged from the subsidiary structures that flanked the main pyramid. The obsidian-edged weapons caught the torchlight from the courtyard's perimeter fixtures and threw it in directions that made the weapons look like they were burning rather than reflecting. They were 60, approximately. The Norsemen were 31, approximately, the approximation accounting for the variable status of 3 men who were functional, but who had received wounds that made the function's duration uncertain. The mathematics did not favor the Norsemen, but the mathematics did not account for Hakon. Hakon Bearclaw was 38, of the Nidögr, a man of standard dimensions, except for his hands, which were large enough to wrap around a grown man's skull with the thumb and middle finger in contact, and which he had used in this capacity twice that Ulfric knew of. He was, under normal operational conditions, not the most sophisticated fighter in the group. Strong, effective, reliable in close quarters, but not subtle. The passage's jade-lit walls had done something to Hakon. Ulfric did not know exactly what. He did not have the framework to know exactly what. He knew that Hakon had looked at one of the occupied eye alcove figures as they passed, and had looked for longer than Ulfric had looked, and that what he had seen or what had looked back at him had produced in Hakon, by the time they reached the courtyard, a state that Ulfric recognized from the old stories. The stories the Skelts told about the fighters who had gone beyond the ordinary boundary of what a body would consent to, and had found, on the other side of that boundary, something that the Skelts called the gift of Odin, and that Ulfric, watching it in practice, thought of as the state of having nothing left to lose, because all the ordinary contents of a man's mind had been temporarily vacated. Hakon went into the courtyard first, not because he was ordered to, not because the situation called for a particular tactic. He went first because the boundary between the passage and the courtyard was a boundary that the current state of his mind did not recognize as meaningful. He went into 60 armed men the way weather goes into anything, without deliberation, without trajectory, without the specific organizing principle of survival that gave other men's violence its shape. He was very large, and his hands were very large, and the axe in his right hand was a good axe that he had maintained with the care he gave all tools, and he moved through the courtyard's organized line of 60, as though the organization was an aesthetic arrangement rather than a tactical one. This lasted 45 seconds. 45 seconds was enough. The organized line became disorganized in the specific way that disorganization spreads, not from the edges, but from the center, from the point of maximum confusion, outward. The disorganization gave the other Norsemen's entry into the courtyard a geometry that it would not have had against an organized 60, and Ulfric used the geometry with the efficiency of a man who recognized the gift when the situation produced one. The courtyard fight was 3 minutes. It cost the Norsemen 4 more men. It cost the courtyard's defenders their organization, and subsequently most of their number, the remainder retreating to the subsidiary structures with the specific speed of people who had just watched Hakon Bearclaw conduct his 45 seconds and had correctly identified surviving as the priority. Hakon was still alive at the fight's end. This was a fact that several of the Norsemen noted with the private acknowledgement of men who had not expected it. He was standing in the courtyard center with both hands occupied and the vacated mind expression still present. And when Björn put a hand on his arm and said his name, he returned from wherever he had been with the gradual quality of a man waking from a very deep and complicated sleep. He looked at his hands, he looked at the courtyard.
The gold,
He said. His voice was the voice of a man who had decided to focus on the concrete.
The gold.
Ulfric agreed. Chapter 12. The Taking. They took what they could carry, and they carried more than was prudent. This was consistent with the nature of the enterprise, and with the specific human incapacity, in the presence of sufficient gold, to make fully rational assessments of the relationship between weight and speed. The subsidiary structures adjacent to the main pyramid contained, in their interior chambers, a quantity of worked gold, vessels, figures, flat panels, jewelry of a complexity that spoke of generations of craft, that produced in the Norsemen the same physiological response as the exterior gold had produced from the ridge, but at close range and with the addition of touch, which compounded the effect. Björn enforced a limit. Ulfric backed the enforcement. The limit was pragmatic rather than principled. What a man could carry at a run for the distance between the pyramid and the ships was the permitted quantity, and anything above that quantity was left, and the leaving of it was not discussed. Thorvald found the Jade Room. He found it by following the Jade Light, which had reached the subsidiary structures and was running through the carved channels in those structures' walls as it had run through the pyramids. And he followed the light to its source in a chamber 3 levels below the subsidiary structure's ground floor, where the jade was stored in the manner of a treasury, organized, categorized, the pieces arranged in a system that communicated the same devotional precision as the city's overall geometry. He took 3 pieces. He wanted to take more. He looked at the jade pieces in his hands, and then he looked at the room's walls, which were lit from within, and he heard from somewhere above him the sound that the god made when it was moving, which was the sound of weather moving through stone, which was not precisely a sound, but was what his ears translated the sensation as. He took 3 pieces, and he left the room at a speed that the staircase's dimensions made inadvisable, but that the situation made necessary. Chapter 13. The thing in the sky follows to the water. The retreat to the ships was not clean. It was what retreats from things that cannot be fought are: purposeful, damaged, faster than comfort recommended, and slower than fear demanded. The approach road's paved stones were hard and even under the loaded men's feet, and the ships were a known distance. And the ships were the boundary between this coast and the open water. And the open water was, in whatever accounting the feathered serpent god conducted, a different jurisdiction. Ulfric did not know if that was true. He ran as though it were true, because the alternative was not running. The god in the sky above the pyramid did not descend to the road. It stayed above the pyramid, above the city, above the stone declaration, the architecture of its worship, and watched the retreat with the complete attention of something that was deciding something. The jade light in the pyramid's carved veins pulsed with the rhythm of the decision, slow, tidal. The men on the road felt the tension as a weight between their shoulder blades. Most of them did not look back. The ones who looked back looked once and did not look again, except Thorvald, who looked back 3 times, and who would afterward say that each time he looked back, the thing in the sky was larger than the last time, not because it had grown, but because his eye had adjusted to it, found a new scale to place it against, resolved more of its detail, and that the resolution of detail was worse than the initial impression of simple largeness. The ships were there. Sigurd Ironside had held the line at the coastal tree line and had the rollers under the hulls and the oars shipped and the men at the oars before the retreat's lead runners had reached the water. Hakon Bearclaw was the last man to the water. Not because he was slow, because he had stopped 50 meters from the surf and turned back to look at the city, and specifically at the thing in the sky above the city, with the expression of a man who has been somewhere very far and recognizes in a thing he is looking at a signpost from that place. Björn went back for him, took him by the arm, said his name. Hakon turned from the city and walked to the water. The Grimmer pushed off, the Nidhugger, the Fafnir. The oars found the water with the practiced synchrony of men who had rowed together for years and who were currently rowing as though the rowing had personal consequences, which it did. The city's jade light was visible from the water. The pyramid was lit from within, the carved serpents visible at a distance that stone should not have been visible. The thing in the sky above it, a shape against the stars, that was not a star and not the sky, and not anything the stars had previously shared their space with. The ships moved west, then north. Then the coastline curved, and the city was behind the curve. The jade light was visible for a long time, longer than the distance should have allowed. Eventually, this stopped being true, but the stopping was gradual rather than definitive, and no one marked the specific moment when the light was no longer visible, because no one was looking directly at where it had been. No one except Thorvald, who was looking and who noted the moment the light disappeared and said nothing about it to anyone for 3 days. Chapter 14. What they carried home. The gold was real. This was the first thing confirmed when the ships were far enough north that the specific quality of the southern coast's air had become the ordinary Atlantic air, which was cold and salt and entirely without jade-colored illumination. The gold was real, and it was considerable, and it was worked in ways that the northern smiths would spend generations attempting to understand and partially succeeding. The vessels and the figures and the flat panels and the jewelry would eventually be distributed across 4 settlements and 2 royal courts and 1 monastery, where a monk who was also a historian would write about the object's origin in terms that his superiors would read and then instruct him to revise, which he did, substituting a provenance that the object's actual provenance was then filed behind in the monastery's less consulted archives. Thorvald's 3 jade pieces went with him everywhere for the remainder of his life, which was long. He did not display them. He did not describe where they had come from, except once to a skald who was collecting the saga accounts of unusual voyages, and the skald wrote down what Thorvald said and then, apparently, lost the manuscript, which was a loss the relevant historical record would register only as an absence. Hakon Bearclaw did not speak of what had happened to him in the passage between the preparation chambers and the courtyard. He was asked periodically by men who had watched the 45 seconds and wanted to understand them. He had no answer that he considered accurate. The closest he came was a statement he made once to Björn, which was,
Something looked at me from inside someone else, and I looked back, and we recognized each other, and I don't know what that means, and I am not going to find out.
Björn, who was a man of economy, recorded this in the portion of his memory reserved for things that did not require response and were better kept than discarded. Ulfric Bloodmouth lost 2 fingers on the left hand, which he replaced with the functional adaptation of a man who had been a fighter long enough to know how to make a hand work with what remained. He led 2 more expeditions before his death, both in familiar waters, both successful. He did not return south. He was asked about the southern voyage frequently, at the mid-benches where his reputation had preceded the voyage, and the voyage had subsequently enlarged the reputation considerably. He told the story accurately, which is to say, he told what had happened without editorializing the parts that his audience found difficult to receive. He told it the same way, every time. He did not omit the thing in the sky. He did not omit the jade light in the pyramid's carved veins. He did not omit the 6 in the alcoves and what their eyes had contained and what that had done to Hakon. The men who heard the story were either very young or very drunk or both, mostly, and the very young ones heard it as adventure, and the very drunk ones heard it as confirmation of the world's specific capacity for excess, and neither group heard the part that Ulfric considered the story's actual content. The actual content was this. There were powers in the world that were as old as the world's oldest stories, and that had been conducting their accounting since before any story was told about them. And these powers were not interested in the Norsemen, or in the Norsemen's gods, or in any framework that the Norsemen brought to bear on the situation. And the gold was real, but it was not the point. And the point was that something very old and very large had turned its full attention on 43 men on a pyramid's apex platform and had found them insufficient to interrupt the accounting for. And this was simultaneously the best and most terrible thing that had happened to Ulfric Bloodmouth in 51 years of finding out what the world contained. Not worth interrupting for. He drank to that. Every time he told the story, not in celebration, in gratitude. Quetzalcoatl, in the oldest accounts, older than the conquest, older than the codices that survived the burning, preserved in the oral traditions of the mountain communities that the conquest had not fully reached. The feathered serpent god is described not as a deity of war or agriculture or the sun, though it is all of these in the later systematized theology. In the oldest accounts, it is described as an appetite, specifically an appetite for what is offered willingly versus what is taken. The distinction matters. The Norsemen were not offered, they were not taken. They were, in the relevant accounting, insufficient to be worth the gods' direct engagement. Too few, too temporary, too brief a disturbance in a process that had been continuous since before their particular variety of human had developed ships. This is the part of the story that Ulfric understood and could not convey. Not worth interrupting for, not worth the gods' direct hand. And yet, Hakon Bearclaw in the passage had looked at something that looked back, and the something had recognized what it saw. And recognition in the accounting of very old appetites is not the same as indifference. It is a notation. It is a mark in the ledger. It is noted and set aside for when the time is correct. Hakon Bearclaw died at 67 in his bed of the ordinary causes. The night before, he asked for the lamp to be kept burning. His wife asked why. He said, "Something is coming to finish looking." She kept the lamp burning. In the morning, he was gone, and the lamp was cold, and the room smelled of the sea before a storm, and of something beneath that, something that her nose kept finding, and her mind kept refusing to name. She did not name it. Some things are better left in the older language, the one that has no word for what it means, only the meaning. This has been Feathered Dark by Xtal Chasm. Thank you for joining us.